Okay, perfect. So this is the setup of the EN580T double balloon Enteroscope. I've got all our supplies laid out here, so I'll go through the supplies with you first to make sure that you've got everything you need, and then we'll begin putting everything together. So first thing, make sure you've got your overtube. TS13140 is your balloon overtube. You also want to make sure you have your TY06 tubing, which this has been sterilized, but it's a double tube set. One's clear, one's white, and you've got 2 air filters in there as well. This tubing is good for 10 reprocessing cycles or 1 month, whichever comes first. We've got our scope here plugged in to the processor already in exam mode. I've got a basin of sterile water here with a wet syringe. That's a Luer lock syringe. And then I've also got a slip tip dry syringe. You want to make sure you have both a wet and a dry, and don't mix them up for setup. The dry syringe can be Luer lock or slip tip depending on what you prefer, and I'll show you the differences as we go. You want to make sure that you've got your balloon for your scope, which is the BS2. The BS2 contains both balloons and the rubber bands to attach the balloons. So I've got 1 balloon laid out and 2 of the rubber bands as well. And then we want our balloon attachment tools. So the ST05B is a little cardboard attachment to get the balloon on the scope. And then we have over here our ST10, which is the band attachment tool. And then we've got our valves. The valves are the old style valves, so they look different than the 700 series. We can put those in right away. And then our biopsy valve here, you can use any standard biopsy valve. This physician prefers to have irrigation through this scope, and the scope doesn't have an irrigation channel. So we're using a BioShield irrigator, which is a biopsy valve with a Luer on it, so we can connect irrigation and they can use their foot pedal for this scope, okay? We've got that on the scope. And then lastly, you want to make sure you have the correct tubing for the scope. So for this one, we're using Urbiflow AeroRinse 337 tubing, which is the proper air-water connection here for the 580 series scopes, and also contains a CO2 line as well. So we plug that in down here to our CO2 insufflator. Now, for the irrigation, because the AeroRinse tubing doesn't have an irrigation line, because all of the 580 scopes don't have irrigation channels, we've actually left our 700 series tubing, which is the CleverCap Hybrid CO2 for 700 series scopes. We've left that portion in our Urbi EIP2 pump so that we can connect that to our Luer lock. So we're actually using 2 different types of tubing here. 1 tubing for the regular scope operation, and then the irrigation line from the other scopes to be able to run the irrigation for the procedure. So, step 1. First thing you want to do is you want to take out your overtube. And inspect it. And first thing you'll notice when you take out your overtube is there are 2 lines on it. There's a blue one and a clear one. Blue, think blue like the ocean, blue like water, that's your water line. Clear is your air line, okay? First thing you want to do, and this is where the differences will come in, whether you prefer a slip tip or a Luer lock for your dry syringe. You want to go to your clear line, which is the air line. And the first thing you want to do is blow up the balloon and make sure there are no leaks. So I blow it up just like that. Because this is a slip tip, I'll keep it in there so we're not losing any air. And then I just plunge it into a little cup of water and make sure that I'm not getting any leaking or bubbles from the scope. Okay, so we know now that our balloon is working fine on our overtube. And we can now remove the air from it and put our syringe down. Next thing we want to do is put our overtube on our scope. So the easiest way to do that is to just lubricate it a little bit. So I take our water line and I take our wet syringe. Careful not to mix up the wet and dry, of course. I put a little bit of water, 10 cc's or so is plenty, inside the overtube. And then I just kind of put my fingers over the end and rock it back and forth to get water inside that over tube. And then we have some nice lubrication. Dump that out in the garbage. I'm filming this for you again. You can see this video. Then we're going to put our over tube on the scope. So simple enough. We take the distal end of our scope. We feed the over tube over the distal end of the scope. I've got this kind of backwards. I should have prepared for this. Take our scope, keep feeding the over tube onto the scope like so. And we're going to go until the scope comes out the other end of the over tube. And there you go. Now our over tube is in place on the scope. They're really twisted here. And there we go. Now our over tube is on our scope. And we can now work on applying the scope balloon. So the scope balloon channel, if you come in here really close, comes out right here on the tip of the scope. And the key for this portion is that it's got to be dry. So I always keep, and that was one of the supplies I forgot to mention at the beginning, I always have alcohol swabs nearby ready to go, because what alcohol swabs will do is pull the moisture out of the tip of the scope. So I always start by wiping around the tip of the scope with an alcohol swab, and then I keep that handy. And then I take my dry syringe and I go to the light guide connection on the scope, and right here is where that channel pumps air through. So right now there's a cleaning adapter attached. This cleaning adapter is not needed for the procedure, as your CA606. But again, if you have a Luer lock dry syringe, you can use this on here to actually dry the channel, because that's a Luer lock. So it's up to you. I leave it on there even if I have a slip tip as well, because it's easier to get the slip tip in the channel. So what I want to do, and if you can kind of get both of these in view, what I want to do is blow air through this channel and check to see if any moisture comes out the end. And as you can see, some did there. So now that I've got moisture coming out the end, I'm going to alcohol swab it again. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. And sometimes you have to do this like 5 or 10 times before you actually get all the moisture out. But it's important that all the moisture comes out of that channel, because if it doesn't, your balloon won't inflate properly and it will stick to the scope. So this is probably the most painstaking part of the entire process, is making sure that moisture is out of that scope. And if you have endoscope drying cabinets, it makes it a lot easier, because those channels can be blown out in the cabinet rather than relying on this point in the process. And there's still moisture coming out of there, so I'm going to have to do this a few more times. It's looking almost dry now. I'm going to give it at least one more just to make sure. Still a little bit coming out. Give it one more shot here. There we go. That looks pretty good there. So, wipe it one more time with the alcohol swab. Just make sure she's dried off. And now we can apply our scope balloon. So, next up with our scope balloon, this is our scope balloon here. We're going to grab our ST05B, which I thought I had one out already, but maybe I did not. Grab a new one. So the ST05B is a little cardboard adapter. And it works, it's very simple. So essentially what you do is you fold it in half and you push it into the balloon this way. Feed it over the end. A little bit harder with gloves. And then once it's on there, like so, you simply open it up from the inside, like so. Now you can stick your scope inside it. So you stick your scope inside it like that. And pull the balloon over the scope, like so. And then you just want to pull the end of the balloon down so that it is even with the distal tip of the scope. Okay, so you get it even like that. That's pretty good. And then you pull your adapter or your ST05 balloon attachment tool backwards. And you want the balloon to be taut but not stretched, is essentially what you want. And then you can literally just rip this piece off, hold the balloon in place, and just sort of pull it out. So that right there is a little taut. That's kind of what you want there. Taut but not too stretched. And you want to make sure it's not twisted either. Okay, so now that you're even and you got your balloon on, your ST05B is now garbage. Now you want to apply your rubber band to make sure the balloon stays in place. So that's what your ST10 is for. This handy little guy here is a little counterintuitive. So you pull open to put the band on. And then once the band is on, you want to make sure it's like pushed all the way on, even with the end of the ST05 or ST10. And then you hold it as you squeeze, and it will come back and open up. Okay, so now that that's open, you actually continue to squeeze to pop it right off. So you kind of want to go up to the edge of your balloon, keep squeezing, and it will put it in place. Okay, so now you may have to fiddle with it a little bit once it's on to get it even. It doesn't have to be completely even or flat. As long as it's holding the balloon in place, you should be good. Okay, and then your second one is going to go on the distal tip of the scope, so same thing. We go here, we stretch it out, but not all the way to pop it off. And then you want to go right on the tip of your scope here. Oh, and of course she doesn't want to pop off for me. Do that one more time. Stretch it out, and there we go, that's a little bit better. So there we go, we got it on the tip of the scope. Now it doesn't have to be right at the edge of the scope. If you look really closely here, the balloon channel that we were blowing out is right there. You can kind of see it. So as long as it's below that balloon channel, it's going to continue to blow up the balloon. Okay, so now we have our scope balloon on. Now to test that, same channel we used to blow it out, we can then use our dry syringe again and blow it up. And that looks like it's blowing up nicely. We can dunk it in the water again to make sure we don't have any leaks. It looks like it's not bubbling, which is good. And now we can pull the air back out of it. And I'll just do one more to pull the air out of it. Perfect. Okay. So now we've got our balloons on our scope, ready to connect our tubing and test everything. As you'll recall, I had left the cleaning adapter on here, CA606, to blow that channel out. You have to take that off to be able to connect your tubing. You can take that off, set it aside. Now I'm going to open my TY06 tubing. Maybe. Feel it from right side. Okay, so the TY06 tubing is going to have two different tubes and two different filters. So the filters here go into your PB30 pump. Okay, it doesn't matter which filter goes in which. There's lures on the back, so they lure into the filter, or lure into the pump, and then from there you can grab your tubing. Now, the key with the tubing here is that there's two different types. There's a clear and a white. I'm going to grab the clear first to show you. The clear has this white attachment on the end of it. That's the one that goes to the scope. So where we remove the cleaning adapter, we just pinch these two hoses and click it on, and then it will lock into place like that and will not come out. So from there, we go up to the pump, and the one that says endoscope is where we're going to plug that into the filter, because we just plugged that to the endoscope. Okay? The second tubing, you'll notice, instead of a clip on it, it's got a male lure. So that male lure goes to our overtube. You'll remember with our overtube, we had a clear line and a blue line. Blue for water, blue like the ocean, clear for air. So that black lure, we're going to...
this is more involved. We're going to do
that lure lock we're going to put onto the air line, and then again, we can go up to our pump and connect to where it says overtube. Okay, now we've got our two lines connected for our balloons on our scope. For the water, the only reason we have a water line on our overtube is for lubrication. So I usually leave this off, but that's our wet syringe that we use to get the overtube on in the first place. This can be attached at any point in the case to lubricate the overtube if there's not enough lubrication to move it back and forth on the scope, okay? So we just tell the physician that that's there if they want to lubricate the scope. Otherwise, we are good to go. Now, the last thing we want to do before starting the case is just make sure everything's working properly. So the one thing that's going to be a little bit different for this physician than would be for most is that we want irrigation. This physician wants irrigation. So I'm going to grab our irrigation line and I'm going to attach it to our biopsy port here that has a special irrigation line on it so they can use their foot pedal. So again, that's using two different types of tubing. It's using the tubing for the 580 EN 580T, which is aero rinse that doesn't have an irrigation line, and we took the irrigation line from the 700 series and left it in our pump, and that's going to the scope. Now the last thing we want to do is we can just double check with our PB30 balloon pump to make sure that everything is inflating and deflating as meant to be. So the buttons are fairly simple. The small light means that the balloon is small, and the large light means the balloon is blown up. So if I push the overtube to blow it up, we should see the overtube begin to blow up. Sorry, wrong piece. Where is the overtube? There it is. Overtube balloon is blowing up. If I push it again, it should go back down. And then same thing with the endoscope. If I blow up the endoscope, now we should see the endoscope blow up. And again, if I push it down, it should go down. So there we go. That's the complete setup of an EN 580T double balloon with all the supplies you'll need.